Isa, thank you very much for coming in and talking to me about your experiences before, during and after the Holocaust. So let me take you back to before. So where were you born and what was life like before the trouble started?
Well, I was born in Germany on the 22nd of June 1929 in a place called Heilbronn am Neckar, which is in the region of the Rhine. And my parents, my mother was Paula, and she was a secretary at some stage. My father, Alfred Stern, he was an agent for a typewriter firm and quite well known. We lived in Germany. His parents were German, my grandparents, both sides were German, and I believe also my great-grandparents. So it was good old-fashioned German stock. My sister was born 2 years later in a place called Mannheim, not very far from Heilbronn, and she was called Hannelore, but later on when we moved to France she called herself Annette. Now we were what I would call a middle-class family, and my mother had a lady who came in to do the laundry work and the ironing. We had a little young girl who took us out for walks, and it was what I'd call a pleasant life. I still had at that stage 2 grandmothers. The grandfathers were dead by that time. We used to visit the grandmother who was already in a home, I think only once or twice, and unfortunately when the Holocaust started she was one of the first to go in one of these gas-filled vans. My other grandmother, she was a very lively sort of person. We used to visit her in Frankfurt am Main, and she had a little garden. We used to go in the garden there and pick all her unripe tomatoes, which she wasn't very pleased about. And we used to go on holidays, and as I said, a very pleasant life. And so it was until the Germans came in. Now here we've got, you see, myself.
Oh no, that's it.
Yes.
I'll hold it.
Yes.
So.
Myself, and it says on her own 2 feet, with my father, Alfred, my mother, Paula.
And that little one is you.
That's me, yes. This was in Mannheim before my sister was born.
Okay. There we are. So when did life start to change, and what changed? Because you've described a very pleasant, not idyllic necessarily, but a very pleasant and comfortable and normal
Quite, yes.
early life.
Yes. Well, of course, everybody knows when the Nuremberg laws were enacted by the Nazis, Jews began to suffer. The first thing that happened then was that the male Jewish population began to be rounded up and sent to Dachau. Sometimes they were able to leave Dachau, but most of the time they were deceased there, they died there. So when we moved to Saarbrücken, which is on the side of Germany between the frontier of France, that is just on the border, and my father's firm decided to transfer him to France. He took the opportunity to go. And so from that time onwards, we didn't see him except for visits which we paid to Luxembourg, which was a neutral little country it is. And there we spent our holidays together, mother, my sister, myself and my father. He returned to France and we went back to Saarbrücken. In Saarbrücken I attended the school, which was a little Jewish school attached to the synagogue there. Okay. And not very many pupils. And I remember my first day there, it was a custom in Germany for children who started school to bring little cornets of sweets, well it was paper cornets of sweets, and you shared those out, which was a nice little custom, made life quite sweet for the first day.
Would be allowed in school these days?
No, I don't suppose it would. And attending school there, we noticed already that some of the male teachers were absent. And of course, as I explained to you, that was due to them being sent to Dachau. Later, of course, things became a little more personal. When I remember one incident when the young SS officers barged into the flat that we were living in, and my mother, of course, was well aware of what was going on, and we were not, we children were not. And
well, what sort of year are we talking about here?
Well, I think it would be just the year 1937. And she shooed us out of the apartment. We didn't want to go. There's a yard downstairs. She wanted us to go into the yard. But we stayed outside the door listening in, and we could hear a lot of banging and rummaging and things going on. What they were doing, they were presumably searching for weapons. Of course, that was all a nonsense. They were searching for these weapons, and we had a sideboard, and in the sideboard there were some medals from my maternal grandfather. He was a soldier in the First World War, and also I think in the Franco-Prussian War he was a major, a tambour drum major. And there were some medals there, and my mother, who was, as I said, very feisty, she attacked them and she said, "Take these medals," she said, "pin them on yourselves. You are such heroes, you pin them on yourselves." Anyway, eventually they went, and of course, as I said, it was pretty near the actual war, because as the times were quite bad for Jews already then, and we were trying very hard to escape from that. Well, my mother was trying very hard to escape and take us out of Germany, and my father was of course doing his best also, because he was trying to get us visas to get over to France to join him. And so in 1938, just after the Kristallnacht, when we saw the synagogue already in flames, we managed to pack up, and my mother packed all the essentials, and some of the stuff was going to come later. And these are the passport photos.
Okay.
Here. And my father, and my mother, myself, my sister, as we had them in the passport crossing the frontier.
So you say you've taken us to where you're at the border, escaping from or leaving Germany to go to France, and with you you've got your mother, and there's yourself and your younger sister. So how was the border crossing? And then when you arrived in France, how did life fare then?
Well, at the crossing, naturally, there was a great search going on in the luggage and body search. The Germans were afraid you were perhaps smuggling out jewellery or gold coins and things that were not allowed. So as they were searching, we children, we had our dolls with us, we were cuddling our dolls, and one of the customs officers took my sister's doll and started tearing the legs and the arms out to see if there was anything tucked inside. And my sister started howling and was very upset about it, that they were so cruel to the dolls. But of course what we didn't realise, that the Nazis were not only cruel to dolls, but of course cruel to human beings, which was the Holocaust. Now, arriving in France, we made our way to Paris. My father met us. We had an apartment in Paris, 86 Rue Botzaris, in the 19th arrondissement, just opposite the metro station. It was a very nice apartment. We went to school in Paris, a little Jewish school which was sponsored by the Rothschilds, and we endeavoured to learn the language. And my father still carried on with his career, with his work. My mother was in the apartment and looked after us. And during the spring of 1939 and the winter of 38 to 39, we seem to have caught every tonsillitis and every catarrh and every cough possible. And so it was decided that a charity organisation would send us for recuperation to Switzerland. And in the summer of 1939, my sister and I took the train and we went to Switzerland for a holiday. And I was taken by a very lovely family, a Sephardi couple, and they were very kind to me. And here they are. There is Helen Pinto, Mika Pinto, and myself, Isa. And they looked after me in a style. They had a lovely villa just outside Geneva. They took me on a holiday to the mountains and pampered me and really looked after me. My sister wasn't quite so lucky with her family, I must say. And they asked me to write cards home to my parents, and I still have one or two of the cards from the mountains where we made our holidays. And I wrote quite proficient French already, so that wasn't too bad. And in fact, Mika and Helen Pinto played a very important role in my story, because later on during the war, when my father and my mother and ourselves were separated and in different countries at war with Germany, my father wrote from England to Switzerland, and they passed on the letters to my mother because my mother had written to them, so they became a really important couple and very kind. As the war was approaching in the sort of late summer of 39, of course we had to go back to our parents, and we arrived back in Paris, and the war, as you know, started in September, so it wasn't very long before we were evacuated from Paris, because Paris, like London, had a policy of evacuating juniors from the city. So we were evacuated with the Jewish Girl Guides. Very strong movement in France. The Jewish Scout movement, and they had already prepared children's houses all over France to accept, mainly of course, Jewish French national scouts. That is the Girl Guides, the Brownies, and the Scouts and the Cubs. So they were prepared for this, and we were included in one of their houses. The first house that we went to was not very appropriate, and then we came back to Paris and we were re-evacuated then to another place, which was Villefranche-de-Rouergue. And in this chateau, so-called, we spent the winter of 1939 to 1940. The accommodation there was very sparse and very not suitable at all for the young children that we were. We slept on mattresses made of straw on the floor. The windows didn't have any glass in them. Toilet facilities were really very poor. And there at night you were sort of cocooned in a blanket, and there was a safety pin there to keep you all together, and if you had to go to the toilet, it was you know, it was very pleasant. There I made acquaintance, unfortunately, of creepy crawlies like fleas and lice. And these conditions are actually described in two books which were written by gentlemen about the French Scouts and their role during the war, because they also had connections with underground movements. They had clandestine activities. The churches, the people who wanted to escape, they used to spend nights in these houses before they went on to somewhere else. So they also had a role with the Maquis. So they had quite an important role in that respect, as well as, of course, looking after us children.
Okay. No. So did you stay with the Scouts? Here we've got the Scouts, and this I presume is yourself.
Yes.
So did you stay with the Scouts in the chateau in Villefranche-sur-Rouergue?
We stayed with the Scouts, but not in Villefranche. Now I have to explain to you the following. My father enlisted in the French army, and he was off with the French army. My mother stayed in the apartment in Paris. As the Germans were approaching quite quickly through Holland and Belgium, the French police arrested all the ones we call the enemy aliens, not French nationals. Now my mother and us children had, of course, lost our German nationality, but that didn't count in France. She was still known as a German. And so they took her to a cycle stadium in Paris called the Vélodrome d'Hiver. There they interned all the enemy aliens. Now my mother kicked up a fuss because she said, I am the wife of a soldier and I need to collect my soldiers' allocation, my allowance. And they let her out. And in the meantime, we children, my sister and myself, had left to go to Paris, and we then met her just by chance as she had come out of the internment camp in the apartment in Rue Botzaris. Now we stayed there during the
So
time.
that was a coincidence that
It
she
was.
came back the same day that you came.
Yes, it was. And who knows how many coincidences there are in one's life, which I will perhaps tell you later on. Now, we had been sitting outside the door and had gone up to the dentist who lived upstairs and come back, and it so happened that she came out of the camp, and I believe the only one. Now, we stayed in the apartment, but the situation became very precarious once again, as I said, when the Germans were approaching Paris in June 1940. And so my mother decided we were going to pack up once more and put on our winter things just in case, although it was June, and 2 lots of underwear, and to put a few things into a rucksack which we carried, and 1 little suitcase. And we were going to join then those scouts that had been relocated from that chateau to a far nicer spot in the south of France called Beaulieu-sur-Dordogne in the Corrèze. And we were trying then to join them as we were still scouts. The situation was chaotic in Paris. The Germans were just a few miles away. The bombardment was atrocious. We got into the underground and everybody had the same idea, to get out of Paris. As I got into the underground, my rucksack got stuck in the door, but eventually it opened up, and we sat there like sardines. Coming out near the train stations and going to the streets, it was chaos once again. The crowds were tremendous. All, as I said, they all had one purpose: get out of Paris. And so my mother was afraid that in that crowd, one of us with 1 little suitcase would be detached from her. And so she had the idea of asking one of us to hold on to a lamppost or a tree while she took the next child to the next lamppost. And so we made our way in, sort of securely to the train station. Once again, the trains came in and went out, and they were locked most of the time, and people tried to force the windows open to clamber in. We got into the trains, and the train set off, but not for very long, because the bombardment had done damage to all the railway lines. And then you had to get off and make your way as best you could, either by cart or by taking a lift or a lorry or whatever took you. And people did take people off the roads or walking for a little while to the next station where you could get onto another train or further south. And eventually we reached Beaulieu. And there things were a lot brighter. We had bunks to sleep in, and we had nice food. It was a very nice village, surrounded by, it was on the Dordogne, the nice river. We used to bathe there in the river, and we led a very nice scout life, bonfires and scouting and all the things that you do as scouts. And we also attended school there, in little school. And I've still got a report cards of how I did in these schools. And my French wasn't too bad, my maths was a little better. and so on. And these cards had to be signed by the parent. Of course, there's a non-Jewish school. It's all from all the village children. And as parents were not there, it was the scout leaders who used to sign the cards. And at first, mother was a cook there. But when the Germans sort of took the northern part of France, and France was divided, as you know, into what they called the free zone and the occupied zone. Paris being in the occupied zone, Beaulieu was still in the free zone. So when that was established, the leaders of the Scouts requested that my mother left the job, and she had to hide herself on a farm. Now this farmer had 13 cows. She wasn't very happy on the farm, so she told the farmer that she was very superstitious, and had he had 6 cows or 10 cows it would have been good, but as he's got 13 cows it was no good. And she had taken my sister with her, and they came back to Beaulieu, but she never was the cook there again.
No. Okay, so we're roughly about 1941. You and your sister with the Scouts, your mother is living in a small flat nearby, and you're still in Beaulieu in the south of France.
Yes.
So, over to you again.
Yeah, but it was, as I said, we had a very nice life as Scouts. We'd go and help with the grape harvest. We'd have the chestnuts, picking, collecting, and we'd have outings, etc. And I remember one episode where the Maréchal Pétain, who was in charge of the Vichy government in France, was supposed to inspect all the youth groups, and we were part of the youth groups, of course. And we set out for this place where this meeting was supposed to take place, very hot day, and stood waiting in rows for hours and hours in the sun. And it was unfortunate. I was standing there and felt myself gone. I'd fainted, and I never saw Maréchal Pétain going past at all. So this went on, and you'll be wondering perhaps what was happening.
What's happening? You're there. Yeah.
Now,
where was he?
If you remember, was in the army, the French army. The French army was defeated or collapsed, more or less, and he was lucky to escape via Dunkirk, because he got there, got onto a boat, was asked with the Polish army, who were allies at the time, he was asked, is he a Pole? And he said tak, which meant yes. So he was taken. If he'd said he was a German, they would have left him. So he was brought over to this country. And being in this country, he re-enlisted in the Pioneer Corps. So he'd been in the German army in the First World War, the French army in the Second World War, and now he was in the Pioneer Corps. He endeavoured very hard, of course, to make contact with us, and as I said, the contact was through Switzerland, and he found out where we were. Now his aim was to try and bring us over to acquire visas so that we could enter the country. He approached the chief chaplain of the army, the Jewish chaplain, who was Israel Brody, who later became chief rabbi. He also approached a rabbi in London, Rabbi Monk, and the Home Office. So when it came to February 1942, my mother must have learned that there were some visas awaiting to be collected. She went to Marseille, and there she collected the visas for herself and us two children to try and reach Portugal through Spain to Portugal. That was one of the escape routes from the south of France over the Pyrenees. The other escape route was trying to get to Switzerland, which was really very hard as well because the Swiss were not so welcoming. So we had these visas. She came back from Marseille, we packed up what little we had, and went over the Spanish border. We were, of course, searched again, but it wasn't as traumatic as the search at Saarbrücken. My mother told us to go to the toilets. She tried to get us to the toilet. What we didn't know is that she had sewn some gold coins into the winter coats, and so she was trying to get us to the toilets, which we did eventually. And eventually we arrived in Lisbon. At the Portuguese frontier, however, they said that our entry visas or exit visas, I'm not very sure about that, were not in order. And all plans that we had to take the next plane were thwarted. So we had to stay in Lisbon for a little while, which was in our favour, because we learned later on that the plane that would have taken had been shot down. Now all planes from Portugal to England had to make a detour, and the detour was that they would fly south to the Azores and then north and reach England that way. The memories of Lisbon are very faint. All I remember was that it was a bit of a fishy smell in the fish markets and the fish places there. We then caught a diplomatic plane, very small, not very well equipped either, and I spent a very bumpy ride over and landed in Bristol on the 19th of February 1942, in the middle of the war.
So you're February 1942, you're not even 13 years old, you're 12.
12, yes.
And you've already lived in Germany and you've lived in France.
Yes.
And now you're arriving in a third country with another language. So
yes.
What happened then?
Well, as I said, we arrived in Bristol, and my father met us in his army uniform, and I said to him...
How long is it since you'd seen him then?
Well, we not seen him since 39.
39, 3 years.
Yes, we remembered him, but I hadn't seen him in that uniform, and I spoke French, so I said to him, "Quel rôle de uniforme, papa?" And he laughed, which meant, what a quaint kind of suit you've got on, and he had this fancy, this little hat as well. And as I said, we only spoke French, and we had to adapt to now an English way of life. My father was still in the army. My mother then was taken to London, to Belsize Park, Swiss Cottage district, and into a flat there, sharing a flat with a lot of Jewish refugees.
So where later on in 1942, your father is in the Pioneer Corps, he's Cyrus and sister or wherever. You and your younger sister and your mother are living in this small flat in Belsize Park. And are you at school or what?
No, at that stage we were with my mother, and she was employed in war work, peace work, and this entailed assembling instruments for aeroplanes with little tweezers for the instruments, and she was being paid piece by piece, and we were sort of helping her with this. But of course children were not supposed to be in London during the war, so very soon we were re-evacuated, this time not knowing the language, which was very, very hard, and to a little place called Irchester. My sister and I were there, greeted by people who couldn't converse with us, teachers who couldn't understand us, and the school there seemed to be a religious school, and they had a morning service where they knelt, and we two Jewish girls were not used to that. And even in France, in the village school, there was no religious service. The teachers didn't know very well what to do with us, so for me they gave me sums to do in the main divisions, long divisions, and the French seemed to have a very easy way of dealing with those, and I got through them quite quickly. And although our English improved a little bit, we were very unhappy there. The family didn't understand us, the English porridge didn't suit us, and I kept on prowling around to the train station to see the times for going back to London, and wrote pleading letters to my father to tell him how unhappy we were. And eventually he got leave, compassionate leave as they called it, to see us, and had arranged in the meantime for us to be together with Jewish children. And these Jewish children were pupils of the Victor High School in London, evacuated and installed in Shefford, Bedfordshire, a village as well, in the main building called the White House. Now there's books written about it because the principal of the school, which was run on Orthodox lines, they kept Shabbat and the festivals and Kasher, was Dr. Judith Grunfeld, the wife of Diane Grunfeld, well-known Diane. And as I said, it was run on Orthodox lines. The schools were held in various places around. The meals were in this White House, but we were billeted out in various places, and our billet was in a small little cottage with a couple called the Bettanyards. And they were an elderly couple, quite a sweet couple. She was indeed a very sweet lady. They hadn't had any children. He had served in the Boer War. The accommodation was minimal. It had just a couple of bedrooms and downstairs. The toilet was outside. You had your bath in a zinc bath. And as I said, we were billeted with them. They were glad to have us because it made a foursome for their card games. They taught us rummy, they taught us 21. We played not for money but for buttons. She was a seamstress, so she had loads and loads of buttons. We listened to the radio, which taught us the English, and we listened to Dick Barton, And Monday night at 8, it's Monday night at 8 o'clock, can't you hear the chime? And this way we carried on, as I said, at school, and in the evenings we went to our billets. At school we took various subjects, and amongst which was modern Hebrew and Chumash translation. And there I had to translate from a Hebrew that I didn't know into an English I hardly knew, but I managed to get the sense of it. We had a book to read which was Ivanhoe, and now I don't know if you know what Ivanhoe's about, but it's all about the knights and maidens in distress, etc., etc. And felt it was a very strange book, but anyhow, what was strangest, of course, was the language. To have words like daughter and laughter, same spelling apart from the initial letters, sounding completely different. That was very, very strange to me. But I soon learnt and started writing my essays, and there you are. As a young child, you learn a language very quickly.
Well, I think you, from all I've heard, you did very, very well. And 1947 Sports Day at your school. Here you are.
Yes.
And you didn't finish your education then. You were successful, not only in your English, but all round. And you pursued a further education, didn't you?
Yes, because after the war, when the school went back to London, I stayed there as a boarder and took my matriculation, which I passed, and then I felt that my ambition would be to be a teacher. In the meantime, my mother and father were reunited because my father was demobbed. Now what actually happened was when at the end of the war the Germans launched their attacks with a V1 and V2, my mother was very nervous and she felt she couldn't stand that at all and wanted to leave London and where best to go. And she was told north of England and the good Jewish community, Gateshead on Tyne, near Newcastle. So there she went, and when my father was demobbed, they managed to buy a little house, and there they started making a new living for themselves. So after the war, and after I'd taken my matriculation, I went up, and my sister also, to Gateshead and continued my ambition.
So we're now moving on, we've moved to 1947 and you're now up north.
That's
Gateshead.
Right. Yes.
And wanting to be a teacher.
That's right. My parents, as I said, had settled in Gateshead. My father had been demobbed, and as an ex-soldier, he was allocated what they call a special oil allocation, and they experimented in their kitchen with making crisps. Mm-hmm. Because prior to that, crisps were fried in lard and animal fats, and vegetable oil, of course, have not been used, and because of that, they could be called as kosher. So the first kosher crisps were made by Stearns in Gateshead, with a Herrscher from the rabbi in Gateshead, and distributed to all the yeshiva students and quite a fairly large Jewish community there. I also attended the seminary for a year that was for Jewish girls who wanted to become Jewish teachers. That was led by Mr. Cohn. But after that, I did decide to really take my studies a little further and attended the Teachers Training College in Sunderland. And I acquitted myself quite satisfactorily and gained my certificate. So then I taught in Gateshead for a while, and there I met my future husband, because he had come over as a Holocaust survivor sponsored by the community in Whitley Bay. It was something that people who had been in DP camps and who wanted to come over could do if they were sponsored to be ministers of communities. He had gone through camps he was of Polish nationality, through camps right during the war and through Auschwitz. And he must have liked me, and I liked him. And we got married in Whitley Bay. And as a wife of a minister, now I followed him to first to Swansea, where my two daughters were born, and then to Edinburgh, where we always had a very, very pleasant community there, and later on in Sheffield. And from there my husband retired, and now I live down in Bournemouth.
Okay, so you're in Bournemouth now, and thinking back for all you've shared with me just now, with the traumas, with the fact you had to flee from Germany into France, and from France over the Pyrenees, and eventually land in England, living in Wales, then Scotland, and now you're back in England. So how significant is your Jewishness now?
Well,
or has it been, and is it now?
I perhaps forgot to tell you, of course, apart from my two daughters, in Scotland I also had a son, and so these three children who grew up in this country have not known about war, have not got the same memories of war, but still life goes on. And as I said, I then helped my husband in his ministry. Therefore, I've attached myself wholeheartedly to all the communities that he served, and my Jewishness has always been with me. My feelings about being a survivor, of course, I compare myself in some ways to the tragic story of Anne Frank. She was also born in June 1929, went to Holland, as you know, and did not escape. She died with her family, apart from her father, in Bergen-Belsen, and had not the same opportunities that I was given to realise her ambitions, to fulfil her life, to live a long life. And I've had, by the grace of God, that opportunity, and I feel very grateful to this country. I feel also that I have contributed to this country and have contributed to Jewish life, and feel very much part and parcel of the Jewish community, and my life has been a life of fulfillment.
Well, thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Mum, because actually you have contributed. You're sharing your story, not only with me, with lots of other people. We're very grateful, and very grateful your ending wasn't the same as Anne Frank, because I wouldn't be here, and neither would, so far, 28 great-grandchildren.
That's right.
So, wonderful legacies, and thank you again.
Thank you for asking me.